Ted Bundy sat there calmly, silently, as the guilty verdict was read. The jury had taken 6 hours to decide that the former law student was guilty of the strangulation murders of 2 Florida co-eds and guilty of the attempted murder of 3 other young women. Minutes before the verdict was returned, Bundy told ABC News in a telephone interview that he was prepared for the worst.
In the late 20th century, a series of women disappeared in their 20s and spread across the United States. After intensive investigations, it was revealed that they had fallen victim to a ruthless killer, a criminal who, with his intelligence, innocent smile, and charming appearance, managed to deceive more than 30 victims from various states, staying completely out of suspicion. His self-confidence was so immense that he decided to represent himself in court during a trial broadcasted to millions. What was even stranger was that, despite admitting he enjoyed killing women, many of his defenders and those calling for his innocence were women. This is how the handsome killer, Ted Bundy, became one of the most infamous serial killers in American and world history. Our story starts in 1946 when a conservative couple in Philadelphia discovered that their 22-year-old daughter, Eleanor, was pregnant in her early months. The problem was that she wasn't married and refused to disclose her father's identity. All she admitted was that he was a soldier in the U.S. Air Force. At that time, the idea of pregnancy outside of marriage was strongly rejected by society and considered a disgrace and scandal. As a result, her parents kicked her out of their home. Eleanor sought refuge in a home for unmarried mothers, where she spent the duration of her pregnancy. On November 24, 1946, she gave birth to a child she claimed as her own and named him Theodore Robert Cowell. After recovering, she took her baby and returned to her parents' home. When the grandparents saw the child, their hearts softened, and they decided to adopt him. Theodore grew up with his grandparents as if they were his real parents, while his biological mother treated him like an older sister. Theodore's grandmother suffered from severe depression and received electroshock therapy almost daily. Since she was considered his mother in his eyes, this hurt his mental state, as he always felt deprived of a mother's affection. Although it was his biological mother who raised him, he didn't know that. As for his grandfather, he was a completely different character, stern and aggressive in his dealings with his children and even animals. Despite his harsh demeanor, Theodore looked up to him as a role model and aspired to become like him one day. However, Eleanor realized that this home was not suitable for raising a child, so she decided to take him and move in with her uncle. The decision of a man named Jack, who lived in Washington, came as a shock to Theodore, Ted, who felt that he had been deprived of his parents once again. However, due to his early maturity, he adjusted to the new home and started to be drawn to Jack's character and success as a music professor at the University of Washington. He was also impressed by the new financial status and the comfort of the life he was living. But just as he began to feel settled in this new home, that life was taken away from him once again. In 1951, only 1 year after they had settled with Jack, Eleanor decided to marry a man named Johnny Bundy. As soon as Johnny learned about her son, he decided to adopt him and gave him his family name, making his name Theodore Bundy, or Ted Bundy. Johnny was a kind and affectionate man who tried to make up for Ted's lost father. However, Ted hated his life with Johnny. He considered him a failure and poor because he worked as a cook in a military hospital. Ted saw no reason to leave Jack's luxurious house, which had welcomed them, to live with his mother and her new husband, who couldn't fulfill any of his demands. It's important to note that Ted treated Eleanor as his sister, not his mother. Over time, Ted began to exhibit aggressive behaviors. His personality changed from that of a child who loved toys to one with a strange obsession with knives and sharp objects, and a desire to dissect and torture animals. On one occasion, when he was 6 years old, Johnny's sister visited their home and took a nap. When she woke up, she was shocked to find Ted had gathered all the kitchen knives and arranged them around her body, silently staring at her. When she told her brother and his wife about what happened, they did not react, as though they were used to such strange behaviors. Things worsened when Eleanor gave birth to 4 more children, causing her attention to Ted to gradually decrease. Throughout his school years, Ted was a smart student, but he had no relationships with his peers and did not participate in school activities due to the bullying he endured. He was criticized for his lack of tact and his stutter, which made him feel insecure and fueled a desire for revenge against all the children his age. He began deliberately scaring them and setting traps for them. On one occasion, he dug a hole and filled it with knives and sharp tools, resulting in a deep injury to one of his classmates' legs, leaving her with a permanent disability. During his teenage years, when young people and girls started forming emotional relationships, Ted lacked the courage to talk to any girl. Even when some girls tried to approach him because of his good looks, he only watched them from afar. What further diminished his trust in those around him were the hints he heard from his cousins, calling him a bastard child. These hints led him to search through old papers, where he discovered his original birth certificate. The shock was immense when he learned that Eleanor, whom he had always believed to be his sister, was actually his mother, and his biological father was unknown. This discovery caused a significant rift in his relationship with his mother, and he decided to distance himself from her and live independently. In the later years of high school, he was arrested twice for car theft, but the law in Washington stated that these incidents would be erased from his criminal record once he turned 18. Upon entering the University of Puget Sound, he decided to start a new life. However, he only spent 1 year there before transferring to the University of Washington in 1966. There, Ted began studying Chinese, and for the first time in his life, he fell in love with one of his classmates, Diane Edwards, a beautiful and wealthy young woman from an aristocratic family. Her family had all the qualities that Ted could exploit to fulfill his dreams. Although his initial motive was driven by greed for her social status, over time he grew fond of her and decided to marry her. After a year of studying Chinese, Ted decided to switch to studying psychology. He began working in low-paying jobs, but he would quit after a short period to start another job. Later, he volunteered in the election campaign for the governor of Washington at the time, and from there, he began forming relationships with high-ranking officials in the state. However, his involvement in these activities disrupted his studies, leading him to drop out of school completely in 1968. This decision made Diane feel that she had gotten involved with the wrong person, and she decided to break up with him. This breakup was a crushing blow to Ted's psyche, and it led him to give up everything, even leaving the state. He traveled to Colorado and then to Philadelphia, where he lived with his grandparents. There he enrolled at Temple University, but as usual, he only completed 1 semester before returning to Washington. In the fall of 1969, Ted met a new girl named Elizabeth Klopfer, who was a secretary at the University of Washington Medical School and a mother to a 3-year-old child. Because she resembled Diane, Ted decided to get involved with her and marry her. During this period, Ted began to regain his energy gradually, returning to study psychology. By 1970, he had become very popular among his professors. In 1971, he started working for a suicide crisis hotline. He showed great competence in this work, and the police began to consult him to analyze the behavior and psychology of criminals. Gradually, he started participating in investigative sessions. After graduating from the university with honors in 1972, he applied to the law school at the University of Utah. Because his professors held him in high regard, they recommended his acceptance into the university. One professor wrote in his recommendation letter that he was sorry Ted had left the field of psychology, but he considered that the loss to psychology would be a great gain for law. Ted was accepted into the university, but he eventually did not graduate. By this time, Ted had acquired everything that would unleash the devil within him. In the summer of 1973, Ted began corresponding with Diane again, telling her about the major changes and successes he had achieved after their breakup. However, he didn't tell her that he had married another woman. Gradually, he brought Diane back into the hope of their old love, and she agreed to return to him. In January 1974, without any warning, Diane was shocked when Ted told her over the phone that he no longer wanted to know her, and that his current status no longer allowed him to associate with someone like her. After this call, Ted felt that he had regained his dignity and self-confidence, and his confidence reached a level of megalomania. He then returned to Washington to live with his wife Elizabeth, but with a completely different personality from the one she knew. One night, Ted returned home later than usual. While walking through the streets of Seattle at midnight, he entered an apartment on the ground floor where an 18-year-old student was living. Her name was Karen Sparks, Ted took advantage of her sleep and broke into her room. He broke one of the bed's legs and struck her on the head with it several times until she lost consciousness. Once she was unconscious, he raped her and mutilated her genitalia before leaving the scene. When daylight came, the neighbors discovered what had happened and rushed her to the hospital, where she remained in a coma for 10 days. Although she survived, she suffered permanent brain damage, losing her hearing, vision, and memory. No one could identify the perpetrator since DNA analysis was not as advanced as it is today, and the assailant left no trace behind. When Ted realized he had gotten away with such a horrific crime, he felt an increasing sense of confidence and arrogance. In the early hours of February 1st, he broke into the room of another 21-year-old university student named Linda Healy. He assaulted her until she lost consciousness, then dressed her in jeans and a shirt and drove her to a remote location where he raped and killed her, disposing of her body afterward. About a month and a half later, on March 12th, he spotted a 19-year-old girl named Donna Manson leaving her house at 7 p.m. He lured her back to his home, where he assaulted and raped her. But this time, he didn't dispose of the body immediately. He kept it in his house for an extended period before eventually burning it and disposing of the ashes. Another month passed, and on April 17th, he kidnapped an 18-year-old student named Susan Ranker. He did to her what he had done to his previous victims. Afterward, he returned to his home, living a normal life with his wife, as if nothing had happened. Over the following months, the police received repeated reports of missing girls from different places. However, they couldn't find any leads that would lead them to the perpetrator. The police often concluded that the young girls, living alone, may have left of their own volition, unaware that a serial killer was behind these disappearances. After Susan disappeared, one of her roommates, who lived nearby, went to the police station to report seeing Susan helping someone with a broken arm carry books to a car just hours before she disappeared. She mentioned that the car was a beige Volkswagen Beetle. Days later, a similar report came from another student who described the same car, and it was near Donna's house. These reports led the police to suspect that the incidents were all linked to one person. The police intensified their investigation, but they couldn't pinpoint the suspect. Ted had become close to the police officers and had learned about their crime investigation techniques. He didn't forget that he had participated in their investigations, so he studied the mistakes criminals made to avoid them. At the same time, Ted formed strong friendships with his colleagues and neighbors, and everyone spoke highly of his character and integrity, which kept him out of suspicion. On May 6th, the police received a new report about the disappearance of a girl named Roberta Parks. About a month later, on June 1st, another report came in about the disappearance of a girl named Brenda Ball. Both girls had last been seen helping someone with a broken arm and getting into a beige Volkswagen. As the reports increased, the investigators realized they were dealing with a professional serial killer. They noticed that all the victims were college students, white, attractive, with black hair parted in the middle. Ted was taking revenge on every girl who resembled Diane, his former girlfriend, and the revenge had turned into an obsession with murder. In the early hours of June 11th, Ted met an 18-year-old girl named Georgianne Hawkins on a side street near her sister's house. He used his usual disability ruse to convince her to help him, then struck her on the head as soon as she got close to his car. He drove her 30 kilometers to a remote area east of the city and did to her what he had done to his other victims. In his megalomania, Ted returned the next day to the place where he had kidnapped her, while investigators were still at the crime scene. He took a shoe and an earring that had fallen from her during the abduction and later placed them with her body before returning to his normal life. News started spreading in the newspapers and on television, creating fear among the residents of Washington and Oregon. Despite the police refusing to disclose the method of abduction, they warned parents not to let their daughters go out alone at night, especially in quiet or isolated areas. This warning provoked Ted, and he saw it as a challenge. On July 14th, he drove to Sammamish Lake Park, and in broad daylight, in front of a large crowd, he kidnapped a 23-year-old girl. Her name was Janice. Ted took her to a remote location, and then returned after 4 hours to the same place to kidnap another 19-year-old girl named Denise Naslund. He took her to the same place, where he killed both girls and disposed of their bodies. The disappearance of two girls from the same location in broad daylight caused a huge stir, and the police quickly rushed to the scene and began their investigation. For the first time, they received detailed information about the suspect. For witnesses confirmed that a handsome young man, dressed in tennis clothes and wearing a medical sling on his right arm, had asked for their help to remove a sailboat from his car, but they had refused. He then approached others. 3 more witnesses reported seeing the 2 victims with a young man matching the description, speaking with a British accent and introducing himself as Ted. They gave a detailed description of his features to the police. This was the first time the police had gathered so many details, making them confident that this person was responsible for the previous crimes. Based on these descriptions, the police created a composite sketch of his appearance and published it in local newspapers and TV stations, warning people to be cautious and report him if they saw him. When these details spread, many of Ted's acquaintances were shocked by the resemblance to the sketch. Some refused to believe it was him, but others became suspicious and decided to report him. Among them were his wife, Elizabeth, a psychology professor who had taught him, and a colleague and a female coworker. However, due to the large number of reports the police were receiving daily, exceeding 200 calls about suspects, Ted Bundy, the educated and polite man, was the last person they thought to investigate. Throughout this period, the police hoped to find one of the victims alive or that the perpetrator would demand a ransom, which would allow them to track him. But on September 6th, 2 hunters found skeletal remains, which were later identified as belonging to the 2 recently kidnapped victims. After combing the area, the police found a femur that belonged to Georgianne Hawkins, who had been abducted on June 11th near her sister's house. 6 months later, a group of students discovered more skeletal remains and skulls on Taylor Mountain. The police were able to identify the victims, confirming that the killer not only kidnapped his victims but also murdered them and left their remains out in the open without any hesitation. The spread of the news in the newspapers caused panic among the residents of Washington and Oregon, making the area seem unsafe. As the concern grew, Ted decided to continue his law studies, but this time in a different state, away from the spotlight. In August 1974, he enrolled in law school at the University of Utah and moved from Seattle to Salt Lake City. A month after arriving in Utah, he found that the studies had become more challenging as he grew older. Despite his decision to focus on his education, his mental state deteriorated, and he returned to killing. On September 2nd, he took advantage of a woman looking out of her apartment window, assaulted her, and strangled her. The next day, he dismembered her body and threw the remains into the river. A month later, he kidnapped a 16-year-old girl and held her captive in his apartment for 24 hours before killing her and disposing of her body. On October 18th, he grew bolder and kidnapped the daughter of a police officer. 9 days later, her body was found in a remote area. The autopsy revealed that she had been alive for 7 days after her abduction and had endured severe torture. On October 31st, he kidnapped another 17-year-old girl and repeated the same method with her. She survived for 20 days, during which she endured unimaginable torture before Ted strangled her and disposed of her body. On November 8th, Ted disguised himself as a police officer and went to a shopping mall called Fashion Place. There, he began looking for a girl who fits his usual profile, and he chose a girl named Carol Duranch. He told her that her car had been stolen and that she needed to accompany him to the police station to file a report. Indeed, Ted was able to lure Carol with him, but she was shocked when she found that the car she got into with him didn't look anything like a police car. When she asked him about it, he explained that the car was just a decoy to prevent suspicion that he was a police officer. Since he was handsome and spoke with confidence, Carol believed him and got in the car. During the ride, Carol noticed that the road they were taking didn't lead to the police station. Gradually, worry started creeping into her, and just as she was about to open the door to jump out of the car, Ted suddenly stopped. He started hitting her and pulled out handcuffs, trying to restrain her hands. Fortunately, he only managed to cuff one of her hands, giving her the opportunity to use her free hand to open the door and escape, becoming the first victim to survive Ted Bundy's grip. After escaping, Carol went to the nearest police station and reported what had happened, providing a detailed description of the attacker. However, since the incident occurred in Utah, which was far from Washington, where the other crimes had taken place. The Utah police were unaware of the details of the previous crimes or the criminal they were looking for. Therefore, the police created a composite sketch based on Carol's description and published it in the newspapers, along with a detailed description of the car. At that time, Elizabeth, Ted's wife, became certain that her husband was the one committing the crimes, especially after she found strange items in his closet, such as nylon stockings, handcuffs, bandages, and a saw. This made her sure that his travels weren't for studying as he claimed, but to continue committing crimes in a new state. Elizabeth contacted the Washington police again to report him, but no one believed her. This forced her to contact the sheriff of Salt Lake County in Utah, where she informed them that the person they were looking for was her husband, and he was a serial killer in Washington. As a result, Ted was placed on the list of suspects, but there was no direct forensic evidence to convict him. As time passed, Ted began to feel that attention was turning toward him in Salt Lake. However, he didn't know that his wife had been the one to reveal his secret. So he decided to take advantage of the university holiday to return to Washington, where he spent a week with Elizabeth. During this week, he attempted to kill her twice. In one attempt, while they were walking near a lake, he grabbed her head and submerged it underwater with all his strength. When she was close to drowning, he released her and smiled a terrifying smile, saying,
"I was just kidding."
Although she was sure he wasn't joking, she couldn't confront him for fear he would actually kill her. After the week ended, Ted left Washington again, this time heading to Colorado. There, he committed 5 more crimes in the same manner. One of his victims was a girl who was only 12 years old. To this day, no bodies of the victims he killed in that state have been found. Despite his skill in evading capture after committing crimes in Utah and Washington, his downfall began in Colorado. On August 16, 1975, Officer Bob Howard was on a night patrol. While reviewing some papers inside his car, he received a distress call via his radio. As he headed toward the distress location, he accidentally entered a street. On this street, he encountered a strange beige car parked in front of the homes of 3 girls he knew personally. As he approached, the driver sped off. Feeling suspicious, Bob began to chase the car. When he stopped the driver, the latter told him he was waiting for one of the girls to go with him to the cinema, mentioning a movie that hadn't been released yet. Bob's suspicion grew, and he asked to search the car. Inside, he found strange items such as handcuffs, ski masks, nylon stockings, garbage bags, and a long rope. He also noticed that the front seat next to the driver was removed and thrown in the back. Because of this evidence, Ted was arrested on suspicion of being a thief. When the police searched his home, they didn't find anything that directly implicated him. Although he kept photographs of his victims, he had hidden them in a place the police couldn't access. They were forced to release him and place him under surveillance. After his release, Ted returned home and burned all the photos and belongings of his victims. However, Elizabeth continued to provide information. While Washington and Utah were swarming with investigations, detectives began narrowing down their suspicion of Ted. Feeling the heat, Ted decided to sell his car to get rid of any evidence that might implicate him. However, the police were able to track down the buyer and recovered the car for analysis. After disassembling it, technicians discovered hair strands that matched the hair of 3 victims in terms of color and texture. However, there weren't sufficient techniques at that time to confirm that the hair belonged to the victims. With no other leads, investigators turned to Carol, the only victim who had escaped. In October of that year, she was shown a lineup of photos, including one of Ted. She immediately recognized him, giving the police their first real chance to arrest him on charges of attempted kidnapping. In February 1976, Ted was sentenced to prison for a term no less than 1 year and no more than 15 years, as investigations into other cases were still ongoing. 7 months after his imprisonment, prison guards discovered that he was attempting to escape, so he was moved to solitary confinement, and it was later decided to transfer him entirely to another prison in Aspen. On June 7, 1977, the first hearing in one of the cases against him took place. Ted asked the judges to represent himself, granting him the opportunity to enter the courtroom in full attire, without wearing prison clothes or being handcuffed. The judge agreed to his request, and during a break in the trial, Ted asked to go to the court library to review documents related to the case. Upon reaching the library, He took advantage of the guard standing only by the door and jumped from the second-floor window. Although the jump caused a severe sprain in his right ankle, he managed to escape. He ran towards Aspen Mountain, broke into a cabin, and spent the night there. The next day, he continued on foot towards a nearby town, but got lost for 2 full days. While returning to the point he had started from, he stole a trailer but couldn't drive well due to his injury, which drew the attention of a police officer who stopped and arrested him again. Ted was once again transferred to prison, this time placed under strict guard in a solitary cell with 3 locks, each key held by a different guard. However, Ted didn't give up on the idea of escape and began planning another one. He noticed a ventilation hole in the ceiling of his cell, but it was too narrow for a person to pass through. Ted started reducing the amount of food he ate and continued doing so for 6 months, during which he managed to lose 16 kilograms. On the night of December 30th, he took advantage of the guards and prisoners being preoccupied with New Year's celebrations and gathered some books he had stolen from the prison library. He used the books to build a temporary staircase and climbed up to the ventilation hole. He crawled through the hole until he reached the guard's room, where he climbed down, changed into a guard's uniform, and calmly walked out of the prison. The guards didn't discover his escape until 17 hours later, by which time he had stolen a car, driven to Denver, and then boarded a flight to Chicago. Ted stayed in Chicago for a few hours before moving to Florida, where he decided to stop committing crimes, change his name, and live peacefully. However, he faced difficulties finding a job due to the lack of identification. He began stealing basic necessities, which reignited his criminal tendencies. On January 14, 1978, he attacked a 21-year-old girl named Margaret Bowman, hitting her on the head with a tree branch and strangling her with a nylon stocking until she died. He then moved to another girl's room, Lisa Levy, and beat her to death. Afterward, he entered a third room where a girl named Karen Clanner was staying and assaulted her severely, causing her jaw to break and her shoulder to dislocate. When she lost consciousness, he thought she was dead, so he moved to another room where a girl named Karen Chandler was staying. He repeated the assault on her, causing a concussion, a broken jaw, teeth loss, and hearing loss. Fortunately for Karen, the headlights of a passing car illuminated her room, which made Ted anxious and prompted him to flee. Instead of stopping his crimes, he attacked another girl living in a nearby building, causing her skull and jaw to break and her to lose her balance permanently. All of these crimes took place in the Chi Omega sorority house around 3 a.m. As Ted was leaving the building, a girl named Nita Neary saw him and quickly reported him to the police, giving a detailed description of his appearance. The police began investigating the incident and found concrete evidence. Before leaving Lisa's room, Ted had left bite marks on her body, and the investigators photographed the marks to use as evidence in his conviction. While the police were investigating the crimes, Ted attacked a 12-year-old girl, killed her after mutilating her body, and disposed of it. This crime angered the police, who intensified their efforts and published detailed descriptions of Ted. Ted realized the danger surrounding him, so he stole a car and fled west. On February 12th, at 1 a.m., he was stopped by a police officer at a checkpoint. When asked to step out of the car, Ted attacked the officer and tried to steal his weapon. A struggle ensued, ending with Ted's arrest, with the officer unaware that he had captured one of the top 10 most wanted criminals in the United States. After the case became a widely publicized matter, Ted's trial was covered by more than 250 media outlets from 5 different continents, and it was the first trial to be broadcast live on national television in the United States. During the trial, Ted once again requested to represent himself, just as he had previously. Surprisingly, despite the horrific crimes he committed, including kidnapping, murder, and torture, he spoke with confidence and calm, even smiling whenever he made eye contact with the cameras, as though giving a lecture rather than being in a serious trial. This excessive confidence led some women to believe that he was innocent. Although the court appointed 5 attorneys to defend him, he insisted on representing himself. One of the lawyers disagreed with his decision, telling him that his chances of conviction were very high, but if he admitted to killing 1 or 2 victims, the judge might reduce the death sentence to a 75-year prison term, which could eventually be shortened further over time. But Ted completely refused the idea of confessing. After several sessions, The police requested that Ted's dental impressions be taken to compare them with the bite marks found on Lisa's body. The tests confirmed a complete match, proving beyond a doubt that he was the perpetrator. At that point, things took a turn that Ted hadn't anticipated. On July 24, 1979, Ted stood before all the witnesses who had seen him committing the previous crimes. Despite his overconfidence and insistence on his innocence, the irrefutable evidence of his dental impressions matching the crime scene marks led to his conviction without any doubt. He was sentenced to death for the murder of the 2 students at the Chi Omega sorority. When Ted realized that things were completely out of his control, he agreed to appoint a lawyer and consented to confess his crimes in exchange for a delay in his execution. He began to gradually reveal information related to his victims, including the locations of their bodies. One day, he openly admitted that he had killed the 12-year-old girl and had mutilated her body. This admission was the breaking point that caused the court to refuse any leniency toward him. Although investigators were certain he would confess to more crimes if given more time, the court was content with convicting him for the murder of 30 victims. In the end, the judge ordered the execution to be carried out. On January 24, 1989, Ted was executed in the electric chair, marking the end of one of the most terrifying criminal stories in the world. And that brings us to the end of the story. Please share your thoughts in the comments. And if you'd like to hear another story, send me your suggestions. For those who want to hear this story on Spotify or dive deeper into the details, you can get the full ebook, which contains additional events and exclusive insights not covered in this video. You'll find all the links in the description below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications for more gripping stories. Thank you for your support, and see you soon in a new tale.